Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 95th episode of Stories of Service, ordinary people who do extraordinary work. And I am the host of Stories of Service, Teresa Carpenter. And today, as we always do, I have another amazing change agent and somebody who is speaking up and speaking out about something that is so important. Leah Stiles, how are you doing today?
I am great. Thank you for having me here.
Well, I'm so happy that you agreed to come on. I've done one show about the military's height and weight and personal fitness standards, specifically the Navy, but I've never really gotten into eating disorders. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about this as a growing problem within the U.S. military. It is definitely under recognized. And there are a lot of people who are silently suffering from this issue. So I'm going to read you guys a little bit about Leah, and then we're going to get right into the questions. If you're joining me on YouTube, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell. If you are joining me on any of the other social media platforms, please be sure to share this conversation. And please follow up if you have any questions or any other issues. So here we go. With the military's archaic and unscientific standards for physical fitness testing, which there are many, many articles about that. I referenced to them in a previous podcast. It should come as no surprise that many of our active duty and veterans silently suffer from eating disorders and don't know where to turn to for help. Additionally, the treatment is lacking within TriCare and Veterans Affairs to address this issue. My guest is on a mission to fix that and bring awareness and to support those who are impacted. Leah Stiles, hailing from Albany, New York, embarked on an incredible journey of dedication and service. She wholeheartedly embraced her call to duty by enlisting in the United States Navy. Beyond her military accolades, Leah is the proud wife of Marlando Stiles and a devoted mother to Alexzander, Ayanna, Alyvia, and many bonus kids, with their beloved bulldog Beaux as a faithful companion. And you can certainly, as we talk, please feel free to correct me on some of those pronunciations. Leah Stiles' extraordinary voyage in the Navy came to a significant milestone with her retirement, marking a transformative chapter in her life. Drawing upon her vast experiences, she established Sea Waves, an organization passionately committed to aiding service members and their families in confronting eating disorders within the military community. Through her leadership, she is not only molding the military's culture, but also ensuring a brighter and healthier future for everyone involved. Her unwavering dedication is providing resources that service members with eating disorders wouldn't otherwise have access to, making a lasting impact on the lives she touches. Welcome again, Leah.
Thank you.
So first off, as I always ask every guest who comes on the show, I know you grew up in Albany, New York, but what inspired you? That's not really a military town, and maybe it is. I'm not sure, but I don't think it is. So what inspired you to join the service?
I did always feel a calling to serve, and I've done a lot of reflecting on why I actually took action on that calling. And I believe it's actually because I was searching for something, right? They say when we join the military, we're like running from something or searching for something. And I think I was doing both. But really, when I reflect, it comes down to one word, Teresa, and that's family. I had traumatic childhood. I struggled with understanding family, identifying family, and my recruiter explained that the Navy is a big family, and I was just in after that. And I have to say that's what I loved the most about my time in service was the family that I built.
Right. And I think, somebody who myself has had a very traumatic childhood, I do think that call to service and that being that part of something bigger than yourself gives you sort of that sense of belonging and that sense of purpose. And I think that it really does inspire people to want to break free of those circumstances growing up and be able to make something of yourself. So would you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was an opportunity. The Navy provided a great opportunity for me to succeed and grow. And then, all of the aspects that it delivers, the free college education and the medical coverage, all of those things were definitely factors in me making a decision to dedicate my whole life that way.
So when you first initially went into the military, where did you go and what did you become?
I went straight to DINFOS, which was Fort Meade, Maryland, and I started off as
information school for those of you who, yes.
You're going to have to stay on me for acronyms.
No, it's all good.
Yes, and I became a photographer, a Navy photographer there.
Okay. So, did you have some background within your childhood of taking pictures or doing anything in media?
So I was 21 when I joined the Navy, and the few jobs that I held, before I joined the Navy were photography related. I was the photographer at the JCPenney studio, at the Walmart studio. So it was still photography passion, but a little bit different, like more studio photography.
Right, right. And so, you enter into the service. You said, what was your first duty station?
Was Oceana, Visual Information Center, Oceana.
Okay. And you're going along in your career, and you're at that point a photographer's mate. You're not a mass communication specialist, as they are now called in the Navy. So, tell me a little bit about those early years in your career, and how those were for you.
Oh, I absolutely loved being a photographer. I did start off at Oceana as show duty as my first tour, but I think that I really experienced more of the Navy and then more of the photography side of things when I checked onto my first ship. That was the USS George Washington. My first day on the ship was our first day of deployment. Um,
Hmm.
so that started an adventure right away. Um, and I just really think it's great. Like I know that we have a wonderful job. It's probably not as easy as everybody thinks it sounds, but it's so rewarding, and it's like once in a lifetime opportunities. My a lot of my day to day was taking pictures on the flight deck of watching aircraft like take off and land, and that's just magnificent to me. That's never been lost on me how just amazing that is in itself.
Yeah, and I think the most stressful part about being a professional communicator that a lot of people don't talk about is the idea that you can really be assigned to do anything and everything in the communication space. So there is really no barriers or boundaries on what they want you to take a picture of or what kinds of stories they want you to do. And so everybody has an opinion on those things. And so it's your job as the communication department to prioritize and to meet your commander's intent, but then also work with your staff. And so it's definitely an amazing leadership opportunity, and I'm sure you got to experience that as you went up through the ranks.
I did. I served as a photographer about till my halfway point in my career, and then we merged with the other ratings on journalist, draftsman, um, uh,
Lithographer.
lithographer. That's the one I always
Mhm.
forget because it's the
Yeah,
smallest. And so
right.
we all merged together, and then became, mass communication specialist. And then from there, I was kind of already in a khaki position there as a chief, and so that's when I really just started transitioning more to the public affairs sides of things. Um,
Mhm.
which again, I really enjoyed. It was great, great opportunity, and very fulfilling.
So when did the stuff with the eating disorder start? What was that like for you? And where was that? How did that happen?
So, initially it started when I was 12. I was diagnosed with anorexia at 12. Um, I was placed into different residential places to live and treatment facilities until I was 16. Um, then I had my son when I was 18, and I just went into full recovery with anorexia through my pregnancy. And I stayed in recovery until I joined the military at 21. The first time that I had to make weight publicly, I didn't realize that, we had a scale in front of a gym where everybody was, my peers, my junior sailors, like everybody was there. And I was just over a pound over. But nobody knew that. It just said fail. Everybody was like, oh, she failed. Hey, she failed. And then, it was a pound, but it really stressed me out. And then, the beautiful days of what we call rope and choke, where, after you fail, the initial scale weight, they measure your neck, your
So
waist.
explain what they mean by they measure your neck. They take a measuring tape and they put it around your neck, right?
Right. To gather the inches there. And then there's like some kind of calculation where then they subtract the inches of the smallest part of your waist and then account for the largest part of your hips. And that all is how they calculate BMI. And as you probably pointed out before, and already gone down that road, is not exactly accurate. There are a lot of people working right now to get more accurate measures in place for that, because that's an issue all on its own. Absolutely.
Right, because people are in incredible shape, but they can still fail the rope and choke because they don't meet the particular dimensions that the authorities have said that are the standard. So, can you explain to people? And I'm uneducated about this myself. The differences between like, okay, eating disorders is a blanket term for a bunch of different conditions. There's anorexia, there's bulimia, there might be more. Can you explain a little bit to people who are just uneducated like myself about this issue?
Sure. So a lot of us have heard about the top three eating disorders, through TV or Lifetime channels, or just, talking, people are familiar with the term anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating. Those are the top three.
Yep.
Just recently, in the last year, in the DSM-5, which is the catalog that is used to diagnose, all mental health illnesses. They've changed it now from 3 to 7. Some say 8, some say 7.
Really? Huh.
And so there's others, and then that are just even beyond me to understand. I've met several people with them, but they're very hard to identify and treat. And so there's even a 2 categories in which they say not otherwise specified. So meaning if you meet the criteria of this one and this one, there's no name for that. So they put it in a category that's broader. And I faced that with my own diagnosis. Like I said, when I was a child, I was diagnosed with anorexia. As I got older, that diagnosis kind of changed, but that my diagnosis changed before there was a name for it. I had a purging addiction along with my anorexia. So that's restriction and purging. There was no name for that then. It didn't qualify as bulimia, as you would probably assume that it would. To be diagnosed with bulimia, you have to have a history of binging. My history was with restriction, so I didn't have a history with binging. So I didn't fit that diagnosis. It took multiple years, well over a decade, before that was diagnosed as its own criteria of an eating disorder.
So basically, the way I kind of understand this is that an eating disorder is really just a unhealthy relationship to food. It's either restricting your food, it's throwing up your food, it's is it but then it's not, is it also overeating? Is that considered an eating disorder as well? Like people who gorge on food? I mean, I'm just trying to think in my mind all the different ways that somebody could have an unhealthy relationship with food.
Oh, absolutely. It's the full spectrum. And then yeah, we have to keep in mind it's not all or nothing. A lot of times the people that are binging are coming off days or weeks or even hours of restriction and that mental restriction. And so then when they have the opportunity to be around food, it's really a big control issue, right? And so you're either very much in control or you lose control, and it's definitely related to control with food. And so, even the people that struggle with binge eating oftentimes struggle with restriction and then with compensation behaviors afterwards. So a lot of guilt comes after binging. And so that's when people will sometimes do things to expel calories. This is what we see a lot in the military before weigh-ins. People don't realize that this could be disordered eating or disordered behaviors, is because
Right.
it is kind of common in our culture.
Normalized.
It is normalized to shrink our bodies before weigh-ins. Even the smallest frames don't want it written in their record that they were this weight when they're normally this weight, and so they take compensatory. I'm going to get that word right, but they take behaviors afterwards to compensate for it. And so yeah, when you do that repeatedly or enough, or or use it as a coping mechanism, which often that came from me. I used my purging addiction as a coping mechanism. In the military, we don't do drugs. We shy away from alcohol. So it was a coping mechanism that was readily available to me, no matter where I was. It helped with my stress. It helped
That's what I was
with.
gonna ask. Is it something that you turn to? That's what alcohol does for me. It's certainly a crutch that, when I'm stressed, if I just have a drink or two, it just helps relax me. And I'm trying to understand eating disorders. Is it an insecurity with someone's body? Is it more something that you do when you're stressed because you can control? It's something that helps you relax. It's just something that I truly, I hope you don't mind me asking. I'm just curious, and I would imagine other people are too, because it's something that people don't talk about.
Right. And to answer, it's all of the above. And at different times in my eating disorder journey, it filled different
Voids.
avenues for me. Yeah, it filled
Mhm.
those different things for me. Of course, there was a point in my eating disorder where I absolutely hated it. It was truly miserable, very, very, very low point in my life. And then you hate the eating disorder, right? But it's just as possible when you go through recovery or healing, or you're not in the full throes of eating disorders, that you miss it because of the release that it does give you. I remember arguing when I was on the aircraft carrier to one of my leaders that knew I was purging and didn't like that I was purging. But I argued, we have a smoke deck. Okay. We have a smoke deck for sailors to go smoke cigarettes after they're stressed and take 5 minutes to readjust themselves, calm themselves, smoke a cigarette, and get back to work. And so I kind of saw my habit very similar to that. Like, hey, after meals, I need 5 minutes to just go to the bathroom, get myself
Wow.
together, reset myself. And you can't ask me to stop because it's not illegal and it's unhealthy. It's not anymore. Well, to me, it wasn't any
At the
more
time,
unhealthy
yeah.
than cigarettes.
Yeah, and really it's not. I mean, we have a way of seeing different drugs differently. I'm addicted to caffeine. I take 200 milligrams every morning. Does that make me a drug addict? I mean, in some people's eyes, it
Mhm.
doesn't. Many people's eyes, it's normalized. But does it ruin someone's life maybe the way fentanyl does? Perhaps not. But it's still a drug habit. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves about those things. Um, and so I can see where you would get defensive and say, well, this is my coping mechanism. This is the way I deal with my day. Um, so tell me a little bit about when it got to a place where you felt that you could no longer control it as a coping mechanism and it sort of became something more.
So that actually happened at different points throughout my career. It's sort of like a roller coaster, as in with like any addiction, right? Sometimes, especially with eating disorders, they're related a lot to perfectionism, and the drive in the military to go up in rank and proceed
Right.
has a lot to do with perfectionism. So for me, those mirrored each other. The better that I was doing in my military career as a leader, or chief or a senior chief, was oftentimes when I was doing the worst with my eating disorder. So that was really confusing and conflicting for me to understand um, the actual definition of success, right? Because on paper, I was being very successful. And so that was a really hard thing for me to balance. A couple times of note that it involved my career. For the first 10 years, nobody knew at all. My
And would you
family.
do it routinely those first 10 years, or would it be something that you would do for a little while, stop for a few months, start back up again?
Yeah, there was some gaps. There wasn't a lot of gaps for me. Um, Probably I think for the first 10 years, the longest I had gone without behaviors was about a month. I could
Mm.
stop it for about a month sometimes. Um, and then by the time, the end of the month, I couldn't control it anymore. And so that's what we call like harm reduction. I thought I was practicing harm reduction. And so it's essentially saying that rather than quitting something cold turkey, I'm going to practice it safely. And so I was just convinced that I was practicing it safely.
This
Um,
is so similar to sex addiction. This is so similar to drinking. I had no idea, Leah. No idea.
It is, and it shows up in a variety of different ways, so many different ways. Um, there was times that especially in the first 10 years, that I was hoping to get caught. I was hoping that a leader would catch on, or there's many times that I got sent to medical for being dehydrated or electrolyte imbalance, or my teeth, the enamel in the back from purging from the acid deteriorated. And I was thinking, like, they're about to find out, and then somebody might be able to get me help. So then I would do things to kind of test and investigate if they could get me help, right? So I would engage them in conversation to understand their level of understanding about eating disorders, the available resources, and things like that. And I came up empty a lot in the first 10 years. Well, really the whole 20, but the first 10, people were just really uneducated. And if you think we're struggling with education now, those first 10 years were really hard. And I kind of compare it to when I came in the Navy. Like, we didn't exactly talk about PTSD when I first came in. And so you and I, we saw the evolution of that, right?
We
Like,
did.
where we
That's
talked
why I'm in
about
therapy now. I would never be in therapy if this hadn't been destigmatized. Never.
Exactly. And so that process kind of had to happen where it wasn't taboo. We did talk about it. We understood resources. We took the stigma off. We knew to support about it. We educated each other in multiple different ways. There was campaigns of education everywhere, support everywhere. And so really, people ask me, like, what is my overall goal? And, while I have a ton of them, right, I do want to see eating disorders referenced, openly, the same way we learned to do with PTSD.
Right, right. And that is certainly still a work in progress. I mean, even as you're telling me things, I don't think that I truly understood what an eating disorder was. I understood there's people who purge. I understand there's people who have anorexia. And I've watched a couple documentaries about people with anorexia and the control associated with anorexia. But I don't think I ever saw it the same way I would an addiction. I think I saw it as maybe somebody who had a body image issue, or somebody who just but it is very similar. It is similar to any other crutch. And so when you were managing it for this 10 years, trying to sometimes talk to people about it, what would happen if you told, like, a close friend? I mean, your close friends had to have known you were doing this, and how did they react?
Well, so I kind of had this rule because, my husband kind of knew about it, right?
Sure.
And I just kind of had a rule. Like, I'm a very, maybe independent. I don't know, maybe somewhat intimidating. Maybe it's the New York thing. And it was just, this is what I do, and you don't get to ask about it. And so I was just very brave. I mean, I would say after lunch, give me a few minutes. I'm going to go throw up my lunch, and I'll meet you guys back at the meeting, right after. It was very normalized for me because while it was secretive, and I kept so much of it a secret, there was some that was above, the iceberg that's above the water. And then
Right, right.
I
And
left
people
some,
started to see it. Yeah.
above, and I just didn't, allow it to really be questioned, especially by peers or, my husband. But I do want to take a second to step back, Teresa, to where you said we didn't really know, like, what anorexia would look like, and I do want to just take a minute to elaborate on that before we move on. Is that when I talk to a lot of leaders, especially military leaders, and I ask them, what does anorexia look like to you, right? And so almost everybody across the board will say underweight, small framed.
Right.
Yeah, so that's actually only accounts for 6% of people with anorexia. The other 94% are not underweight.
Because it's
Anorexia is
really
not defined by your weight.
it's restriction of food, and anybody
Correct.
who can restrict their food, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a stick figure because they're restricting food.
Right. And
Wow, yeah,
so
that's
look at the
true.
timing now. At my 10-year mark was when intermittent fasting came about. Remember this?
Right, yes.
And so I was looked at as the most disciplined one out there, because people were doing six-hour intermittent fasts and 12 hours, and I was doing 6 days. And they were like, wow, that's really awesome. Like, it wasn't a red flag. And so again, I didn't try to hide that part. I'm like, guys, forgive me at PT this morning on day 5 of of fasting. I called it fasting. We didn't call it restriction because fasting was acceptable. And while yes, intermittent fasting can be helpful to some people, for people that are predisposed for disordered eating or eating disorders, it's a very, very dangerous, slippery slope to engage in.
It's just crazy how we don't really even have these kinds of conversations. And we did have a few people who came in on the call. Just wanted to make sure I acknowledged a few of the people. We have uh, Kiraga Derek, who says greetings from Uganda. We have June Brenner, who says hello. And she also related with you and said she chose anorexia as a method of suicide before I ran away from home from 13 years old to 15. And I went from a healthy athlete of 125 to 69 pounds. And she also related that it was a control factor. Her abuser could not have a say over her choice to do this to herself. And then Brian, whose wedding I attended last weekend, congratulations, always participates in my podcast. So he says hello. So it really is something that people have just these preconceived notions about. So now we're at this 10-year mark, and it's pretty much manageable at this point. Tell me a little bit about where it went from manageable to not being manageable.
Okay, so at my 10-year mark, I was selected for chief at 9, and then I was selected for a really amazing program that's available to mass communication specialists in Syracuse University. It's a
Yep.
1-year school that we have up there. While I was in Syracuse University, now my family is from upstate New York. I would go back and forth to see my family while I was stationed in New York. At that time, my mother, who you and I have had discussed, like very stressful mother situation. I tried to mend some of our relationship together, and I came to our house to do that. When I did, her response was to commit suicide, and that was a pivotal point in my life. That's when my eating disorder just truly got 100% out of control. But I had this reputation to uphold. I was a chief. I was a new chief. All eyes were on me. And I had orders to a command that I've always wanted to be selected to, and I got selected to that command. And, you have to go through training and SEER school, and to go to that command. And so I continue to try to keep it together, but I fell apart in many ways. And so a lot of times for me, it took like a physical indication that there was something wrong, because until I didn't see or feel anything physical, it didn't feel wrong to me. At one point, I ruptured part of my esophagus, and I couldn't go to the military treatment facility, A, because they wouldn't know how to handle that, and B, because I didn't want my command to find out. So I went to a civilian hospital in Chesapeake, Virginia.
So this is after the Syracuse, New York, after the traumatic incident with your mother.
Yep. I get back to Virginia. I do SEER school, which, Search, Evade, Resist, and Escape. It's a very intense school.
It is.
And,
yep.
It's very difficult for people that have a history of trauma because of the process that you have to go through.
You're taken a prisoner of war, and you're made to go out into the woods, and then you're captured. And it is I've gone through it myself. It's a very stressful experience for people who've had traumatic backgrounds.
Right. So I held it together until just after that. And I did check into the command that I wanted to. And then that is when the rupture happened. And because, the mess up with TriCare, and I didn't want it to show up on my bill, somehow the bill from the hospital ended up at my
civilian hospital. So the bill from the civilian hospital ends up at your command. Okay.
Correct. And so at that point, I did get confronted. My leadership had asked around to my peers, the other chiefs and whatnot, and my peers did openly admit, like, yes, we see Leah purge every day, like we know that's what she does, and like they kind of like started putting the pieces together. They're like, yeah, this is something that she has been struggling with. Within 2 hours, I was called to attention in front of my commanding officer's desk. This was the third year in the row that I had been selected. I'd worked under him and I had been selected as the Sailor of the Year. So he'd had already determined that I was one of his top-notch sailors 3 years in a row consecutively.
And you had recovered from this incident in the hospital. I'm just trying to understand, like, you weren't in any, like, a crisis situation at this point where you got the bill, your command had it, they did the investigation, they called you in, the commanding officer called you in his office, but at that point, you're not in a crisis situation, okay? Okay.
Correct. Well, I don't know. Some people would argue that, right? I think internally I was in crisis, but
Right.
externally, absolutely not.
Yeah, on the outside, everything was
Yeah,
fine.
I was handling day to day like perfectly, I would say. Um, and so immediately, you know, and I know now in hindsight that he just didn't have the knowledge to lead, and that's part of the reason that motivates me to help other leaders, you know, with that knowledge. But he looked me in my face and he asked me if it was true, and I'm a very honest person when I'm confronted. The only thing I'm usually ever dishonest about is my eating disorder, because it's kind of like a self-protection thing. But I very honestly answered him, and I thought he was about to send me to medical, and I was pretty nervous about that, but I was kind of ready. But instead, he looked at me and said, "There's no place in my Navy for you anymore."
Oh my god. Well, did he see it as a discipline issue?
He saw it as a readiness issue. I had orders to Afghanistan. I was going to be one of the first females in Afghanistan, and so yeah, I do think he was concerned probably about the my health of the situation. You know, deploying with that, even though I'd done it before and successfully and well. But I think, you know, when you get to that point in your leadership and his position, he was really concerned about mission readiness. And if I wasn't prepared to deploy, that meant somebody else had to deploy
Somebody
in
else
my
had to
place.
step in.
And
Yeah.
if it meant I wasn't, then how long until I was? And why would I collect a Navy paycheck in the meantime if I'm not deployable?
So what happens to you at that point?
I fought it. I sought legal advice, and I went to Navy legal, and I just did everything that I could to fight it, and I won, and I won the chance to stay and continue my service.
So instead of getting the treatment that you needed, and this being a pivotal moment for someone to step in and care and get you help, instead you did what so many of us do with traumatic backgrounds. You just said, I'm just going to gut through it and pretend like there's nothing wrong with me. Like when I got almost kicked out for my psychotic disorder, and I saw that that was what the outcome was going to be for me going to them with this nervous breakdown. I just said, okay, fine, I'm fine. Nothing's wrong with me. Nothing to see here. And that's kind of what you did. You did, oh, nothing to see here. Everything's fine.
Exactly. And I had reached out to, you know, the khaki mess in that command before it got to that point. And, you know, I'd ask, like, do you think I should get therapy? Like, what, like, how should I do this? And, you know, even my mentors and just people that I absolutely adore and look up to this day, they weren't armed with resources or answers, and nobody knew. So once it became clear to me that this is something I could like get in trouble for or get kicked out for, I just abandoned all hope that I could get
Sure.
treatment.
I
Um,
bet.
because I had already kind of been looking myself. And again, like I was a khaki. And so I had access to a lot of resources and networks and other chiefs and medical. And I had a lot of access that our junior sailors don't have. And I was still unable to locate a resource or help or anybody in the military community that had any education about eating disorders. We have nutritionists. None of them have been educated on eating disorders, even though they're educated on nutrition. All of our primary care physicians, our medical officers, none of them have received any training at all on eating disorders. So they can't diagnose them, and they certainly can't get you help for them. So to me, it was like, what's the point of outing myself at this point? So I just kind of stuck it through, you know, as long as I could. That lasted until about 2017. I had
How many
ordered
years later was that from the initial Afghanistan?
7.
So 7 years. And are you still during this time, purging and basically Doing the same behaviors. Okay.
Yes, but I was very, very physically fit. I was running full marathons, half marathons. Again, I was commended for all the running I was doing, but it was actually an obsession, you know.
Yeah, on the outside, nothing to see here. I'm a
Yes,
perfectionist.
but I wouldn't allow myself to eat if I hadn't already ran 10 miles. And so that was like a criteria for me, but it looked very healthy from the outside, right? It looked like I was fit. And I was doing great at running. I don't know how my body handled that with the malnutrition that I was in, but you know, I just kept pushing through. Of course, I deal with the damage now then that I didn't get then, but I get some of that now. So in 2017, I got orders to the ship that I very, very much wanted orders to. I was looking forward to it. And I was very excited when I received orders. I did my sea duty screening, and different things in my sea duty screening did pop for eating disorders. And it was at that time that I was made aware that with that diagnosis, I could no longer serve.
So you say pop, was that because you were honest on your screening?
No, it was because when I was fighting it at that 10-year mark, I did go to medical. As far as the legal process, I did get all of that placed in my medical record. Because again, I wasn't trying to hide it. I was just trying to be accepted with it.
Right, because you didn't get a waiver. So with
Right.
my psychotic disorder not otherwise specified, I had to continue to prove myself all through my qualifications that I wanted for like backseat qualification or become an officer. But what helped is when I became an officer, I got a waiver. So I had this like paper in my medical record that just basically said they are waiving this condition. Because it's not like you really get cured from and it was a psychotic disorder not otherwise specified. So that means that it was not brief psychotic episodes. So it went on for a certain amount of days. So because of that, they couldn't just call it something that was brief. And so it was technically a disqualifying diagnosis. So it sounds like what you had, if I can try to understand this in my own mental health language, is you had what was considered by the military to be a disqualifying diagnosis for military service.
Correct.
Okay, got it. Okay. But it just wasn't flagged and it wasn't noticed until the next time you went to sea, and then it was noticed and they said, okay, you can't go to sea. So then what happens?
So it was actually declined by the ship's medical officer at the gaining command at the carrier I was trying to go to. So again, I'm a very stubborn person.
You're like, I'm gonna fight this. They're not gonna tell
I'm
me
going to
I
fight
can't
this
do
again.
this. Yes.
So I requested a meeting with the ship's medical officer. I met him. Of course, you know, I have a big smile and a great sense of humor. Within 3 minutes, I had him signing off the waiver saying I could come to the ship. He said, you know, the last thing you got to do is get the chain of command to sign off. So I asked to speak with the triad. There was only one member of the triad available, and that was the CMC. He happened to have been a former corpsman, so he had an intense medical background. And he calls no punches, and he's very direct. And he asked me a lot of questions about my eating disorder and what my intentions were, and how I could still be an asset to the ship and be mission ready because we were deploying a year later, or maybe a little less than a year. And he asked me honestly, like, what do you need from me and what would I need from you? And so we made an agreement that I would not purge on the ship. I would not purge on the aircraft carrier. And that I would check in with him or medical, either one, weekly, and just make sure that, you know, my labs and things like that were safe and okay, because, you know, there are risks with electrolyte imbalances and you know, other things that come with restriction and purging, just
He
health.
sounds like the first person who cared enough to.
He's the first person that cared, and it was a huge blessing that I met him, because it was him that later on the next year, halfway through my deployment, that saw me deteriorating internally. Again, professionally, I was still very much excelling, but he called me on it. Again, he called me into his office, and he brought back the agreement that we said. I mean, at this point, I was purging. I mean, I guess the numbers don't matter, but it was probably about a dozen times a day. So
you weren't sticking to the agreement because you
not at
know.
all.
Yeah.
Yeah. And and he flew me back. He flew me back from deployment. He sent me home. He did that with the intention. He contacted the Navy Medical Hospital back where I was stationed and tried to make all these arrangements. So as soon as I landed in Virginia, I was supposed to go immediately into inpatient treatment because both mentally and physically, I was in serious, dire need of treatment. When I got back, and I reported there was a major lapse of communication, and, upper leadership there in that hospital tried to figure out what to do with me, where to send me, how to get me treatment, how to get TriCare to approve it. And they weren't able to do that.
Did they just not know how to get eating disorder treatment for somebody in the military?
Correct.
Wow. So, because this goes back to sort of what we wanted to cover on the show too. There really wasn't a protocol. It sounds like there's not a protocol.
There's still not.
So if you have an eating disorder, like I'm active duty in the Navy and I have an eating disorder and I go to medical and say, I want treatment, what are they going to do with me?
They're going to ask a lot of people. They're going to have meetings all the way up to the top, to the bottom, and they're going to come back with the we don't know.
Because they can't put you in inpatient because you're not, like, they can't put you in a residential treatment facility, like for somebody who has alcoholism, for an example, like somebody who has an alcohol or a drug addiction, they would go through SART. They would go through, right, like the SART program. Right. So there isn't a residential, like, contracted out from TriCare. So can TriCare contract out with a, because this is where my brain would go. Okay, yes. You can't give me treatment in the military for a military treatment facility care. What about, does TriCare have a partnership agreement with an eating disorder treatment clinic?
So they did at that time. They do no longer. Okay. They did at that time. And that leader, the CMC, he's now a Fleet Master Chief. He did find that, determine it, work it out. It took many months. It was actually following a suicide attempt. I had a suicide attempt, and they say that the number one cause of death in eating disorders is suicide, and it's because so much is going on in your brain. You can't shut it off. It's nonstop. Alcoholism, you can avoid the bar, you can avoid the clubs, but eating disorders, you have to face food multiple times a day, one way or another. It's constantly there. Right. So the only
sex addiction, well, not, I mean, you don't have to have sex, but it's sort of somewhat similar. It's a process addiction versus a like a food. I mean, not a food, but like a drug that you take. It's
right. You can't just avoid it. Yeah, you can't just avoid it. So following that suicide attempt, I was hospitalized at Portsmouth, like on the psych floor. But even on the psych floor, I was still fasting, refusing to eat, refusing to drink. And there was no protocol there for them to save me either. There was nothing that they could do to help me with eating or drinking. They even told me, like, nobody here is qualified to help you with any of this. There was
this is after the suicide attempt. I'm sorry to interrupt.
I went straight from the emergency room into, I don't know, right.
Like the seventh, there's a certain floor on military hospitals where they have the psych ward, and you probably went to that floor. And I forget which one it is.
Nobody there knew what to do.
Right.
And so then the same Fleet Master Chief showed up to that hospital. Now, mind you, he had a medical background, and him and my husband and those doctors, they fought and they called and they fought and they called, and they did get me inpatient to a place in North Carolina. And I was there for several months, and TriCare did pay for it. My command did send me TAD, no cost orders TAD. They even put my husband on, forgive me, is it HUMS orders?
I know what you're talking about, like the orders where they can be close to you or while you're going through your care.
Yeah, they let him stay home to take care of our children. And so that was very supportive. Unfortunately, I was so deep into my disorder that one hospitalization just wasn't enough for me. I felt an urgency.
You've been doing this all your life.
Yeah. At this point, it was over 2 decades of eating disorder that just needed more than a couple months of treatment. And I very much struggled. I was in and out of that hospital several times. and then other hospitals. But I will tell you, since I founded Sea Waves and I've been fighting to help other people, get treatment, I've not found a place that TriCare will pay for inpatient treatment.
Was this just an exception? Like, I wonder if, like, how was it that you were able to get this when there's been no other person you've ever talked to in the military that could do this? Because I will tell you, there's somebody I met who's going through a mental health issue. She had to detox from benzodiazepines, and she went to a treatment facility for anxiety, like a TriCare contracted treatment facility, and she was in a residential program for a certain amount of months. So I think there's just maybe a lack of education, or like you said, do you know?
So there are some, right? There are some,
Mhm,
but it's such a difficult process that there aren't many people that will fight for it. People that are
mhm.
already, facing treatment for eating disorders are already apprehensive because we know we're about to commit to our whole world going upside down to uh, to start this treatment. There's no little bit of eating disorder treatment. You're just kind of in it or you're not. So at that time, there was more opportunities for TRICARE to pay for things. Since then, there's been some kind of pullback on their behalf. There's very limited cases that it's been done, but it has been done because that day that I checked into that hospital in North Carolina, I met a male CMC Master Chief, an active duty Master Chief, who was there for bulimia.
So yeah, there
He
are
had
these
gotten there.
treatments available from through TRICARE, but they're very hard to find. It sounds like many medical people don't, even people who are in the military medical system, don't know that this is available for people, and it doesn't sound like it's fairly, not fairly, but it doesn't sound like it's really given out to the people who
It's not
need it most.
accessible, right? That's what it is. It's not accessible in any kind of way. Again, I had a fleet master chief in my corner. I, you know,
Yeah.
I had a great network, and it even took us just busting doors down for months and even years. It wasn't an immediate intervention that I required and needed at that time,
It's
which
just
did lead to
fascinating.
my suicide attempt because I felt like there was no help for me.
But Leah, if you had cancer and you needed several months of chemotherapy, what would the military do? They would give you treatment. Yet this is what we go through when we have a mental health issue that we need treatment for. It's like this whole other thing about, like, well, you could just control this. You could do something about this. No. This is a medical issue that I've had for this many years. It's at this point and I need help. And that help should just be given. It should just be a given that that's part of your TRICARE health insurance, is that when you need care like this, the military has to understand that they're going to lose people sometimes to the fight, to get the care that they need, because they're not going to be valuable to the fight if they're not able to properly function. It just, sorry, it upsets me that
It
it's
brings
just
us
seems
back to mission
ridiculous.
readiness. Leaders are
Mhm.
concerned about mission readiness, but this is a part of it. We have to acknowledge it. We can't ignore it. It has to be talked about. It has to be acknowledged, and it has to be accessible. And I know you and I have been focusing on like the extreme end of treatment, inpatient treatment. But we don't even have lower end resources for it, Teresa. We don't have support groups or, Fleet and Family Service Center meetings, or just lower end resources that would be more of like a preventative, proactive measure. We don't have any of that. I really want to establish education in boot camp. Just a small part, maybe just 20-30 minutes, where we say, hey, you're going to see some of these behaviors that seem normal. If you partake in them, you are more at risk of developing an eating disorder. You're going to have different coping mechanisms. This could end up a coping mechanism for you. Don't start it. But if you do, talk to your leader, because your leader is going to know how to help you. But we can't say that yet.
Right.
We just made a whole batch of wonderful chiefs. Congratulations, chief selectees. I urge you, if any of you are watching this, to learn, educate yourself, learn. So they say that 1/3 of females and 1/5 of males in the military are struggling with eating disorders. And so if you look at this command that you are now leading, your team that you're now leading, as we talked about earlier, you can't just pick out the anorexic one by looking for the underweight one. Like, you can't. And so I challenge you to learn more, to question, and then to pursue support and resources. I know they're very limited. I will make a plug for my website, suwaves.org, where I'm trying to build more and more accessible resources. You know, we are trying to build a online virtual support group that is truly anonymous. You do not need your name. You do not need your rank. You do not need any of that. You can just come for virtual online anonymous support. And so I'm doing that right now to fill the gap. You know, we are working with military leaders, and I am trying to get them to see the urgency and the importance in offering these resources. But in the meantime, I'm working to supplement those resources with the civilian resources that are already available.
Yeah, and I'm showing your website right now. I don't know if you can see that. This is Leah's website. Can you see that, Leah?
I can. And if you could go to the resources page in the middle, Teresa, that would be the most important part here.
Okay.
So that first link right there is a 1-800 number or a 1-888 number to qualified eating disorder specialists that can support you in your times of need. They have opportunities for you to have like a one-on-one support. And so that number right there is really important for you to have. Right now, it is only manned 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., but that's still, you know, a really helpful resource. If you
And if
scroll
you're
down,
listening, it's 1-888-375-7767.
7767. And the
Mhm.
next one is the Alliance. This is also a very, very supportive nonprofit for eating disorders. And if you look, I've highlighted there what some of their best resources are for help and the different support groups that they have available. And so I'm working on building these relationships with them to make them even more accessible to the military community. But right now, this is, you know, what we have and where it's at. Oh, geez, I need to fix the top of that, don't I?
Oh, no worries. It's okay. I noticed like when I made it small screen and then made it big again, you could see it. But for those of you listening, Leah's website is www.cseatacwaves.org. And you'll also see all this in the show notes. I'll make sure to put it in there. But yeah, I thank you so much, Leah, for taking the time to come on here and to share your story. I do want to ask you, we got to the part where you were in the treatment. So tell me a little bit about what it was like when you finally got like this professional, high quality, like proper treatment. What did that do for you?
It was very hard at first, you know, because again, I was burying so much so that I could remain professional in my career and in my family. So that was many years. You know, of course, we talked about, you know, my mother's suicide. I had faced other suicide. I had walked in to a friend's suicide, and you know, a lot of that trauma was stuff that I hadn't dealt with, and so it was kind of a mix of like deal with my trauma and my eating disorder, and so that was very difficult. For me, my treatment included multiple NG tubes. So it's a tube that where you're fed up through your nose and down through your stomach, because I wasn't capable of intaking food by mouth at that time. And so that's another thing that really made my situation very complicated, is there's not that many places that actually there's none that TriCare approves of now that offer that NG tube as a treatment option. Again, it's nothing we ever want. It's something I hope I never have again. But when it's necessary, it's absolutely necessary. And that's what it took for me to really come to terms with having substance in my body, nutritional substance, and learning that it was nutritional. So that was a whole process. There is a book coming. I'll make sure that you know when and where that is. I ended up in different hospitals from there, and some pretty terrible living conditions, and, you know, bottom basement of a hospital where, you know, we're handcuffed and just treated like actual animals. And it was just really, it showed me a side of humanity and mental illness that I didn't even know existed. I was just so detached from the reality of how we treat things. And yeah, so it was a very long, difficult process.
How society treats mental health patients. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. And I remember saying, like, I'm not insane. I'm a Navy senior chief. Like, call somebody. I will tell you, I am a Navy senior chief. And they were like, yeah, right. We don't care. Like, nobody cared. Like, I was like, I'm not insane.
So this is your process of being committed to multiple mental health hospitals. And this is kind of the type of treatments. It's interesting you say that, because we have this vision in our minds that that's like something from the 1800s, where mental health patients were treated those ways, and to think that that kind of stuff still happens today is incredible.
It is, and it truly breaks my heart. It truly breaks my heart. That being said, I do not want to scare anybody away from getting treatment. And you know, an NG tube is not the fix for everybody. Do not let that scare you away. But what's important to know is that there's just all different levels of treatment, and there's all different approaches. And you know, as we talked about in the beginning, no two eating disorders are the same, and sometimes they morph from one diagnosis to the other and back and forth. And so having a team that understands the depth of the treatment required is really important to get help that's going to be successful. And so it took me a few attempts, more than I'm proud of, and ups and downs. And you know, we always say recovery is not linear, so
It's
you know,
not,
sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back
of
and
course.
whatnot. But I do want to highlight the importance of having people that are educated to specifically deal with the needs and requirements of treatment at that level.
Yeah. It reminds me so much of what I've been talking about with complex trauma. We love to talk about people that have, we don't love, but we understand, or we have some sort of normalization around people who've been impacted in war, people who've been molested, people who've been physically abused, but we really don't have any language to deal with narcissistic or mental abuse or gaslighting. I mean, we have all those trendy terms, and people in like the cultural circles understand what those mean, but it's a real thing. Complex trauma and PTSD, you know, over and over again, repeatedly from childhood, and then how that impacts your adult relationships. And we don't have a national conversation going about those issues, and about how those things impact us. And so what I hope will happen today is that we expand that conversation to also include eating disorders. To be honest with you, I never saw it or knew until this conversation that it's just like an addiction. I think I saw it as more of an insecurity or a body image issue. I never thought of it as like it's a crutch. It's just this thing you do to relieve stress. It's a way to numb, or like I'm just thinking about all the reasons I used alcohol, you know, and trying to compare that the same way. And it's an interesting comparison to make. So tell me a little bit about what life is like today post treatment, and how, you know, now you've got this nonprofit, you're doing this advocacy, you're writing a book. How are things today?
Today is just so much better. When I retired in 2021, I did try to seek treatment through the VA, and you know, that's a whole nother podcast, Teresa. But I will say it's not any easier through the VA than it was active duty, and so I'm working on that and make those options available as well. But I thought it would be better, and it wasn't, and so I've had to kind of like do a really independent journey of my recovery. Well, I say independent, but my husband and my best friend have done a lot of interventions for me, and have helped me, you know, in my recovery journey. I would say the last 6 months has been the most consistent recovery that I've seen in 30 years. And so that's a really big relief. But even that's complicated, right? Like, I'm very relieved that I'm not silently suffering. But though, I have to work really hard to have alternate coping mechanisms and develop those, because anything you do for 30 years is beyond a habit, right? It's like
Oh God, it's part of your life.
things.
Yeah.
And so now I just try to leave my focus on other people and helping them before they get to the 30-year mark of their eating disorder, you know, being proactive and prevention training up front, and making sure that they have a circle and resources and help, and just at least a buddy. You know, I can't get everybody into treatment, but I can get them a buddy. And so I work on connecting in that, because nobody should be going through this alone, especially when you feel low enough to consider suicide. You know, we get after that in the military, and we talk about, you know, being supportive and ask and treat, and you know, all the things that we teach. But it's really no different with eating disorders. Like, we should ask and talk and treat
Yeah, we should.
the very same, because it's still debilitating, although it doesn't appear that way it is debilitating.
It is.
As for me now, I do a lot of work, getting out support, education, and awareness, and resources. And so I do want to put a plug out there too to other nonprofits or anybody else that can help me expand the resources that I'm trying to offer our military community. I would love any support or guidance, mentorship on trying to expand that. I'm kind of a one-man band on this. I haven't found anybody else that's doing what I'm doing.
Is there anybody else in the military? I'm sorry to interrupt, but is there anybody else in the military who's even doing eating disorder advocacy? Are you the only one?
I've not found them. Hopefully they hear this and they find me, but so far I've not found them.
Wow. Well, I'm glad to be one of the ones to bring this to my audience. I hope I will definitely share this MP4 with you afterwards of this video. You're more than welcome to cut these up into smaller clips. That's one of my main goals, is that I can only get my reach out for my podcast so much, because you need time to break it into clips and put it on, reels and all these other things to make it more more bite-sized and accessible to people, because you've said so many important things today, and you're just continuing to get so many compliments and comments on the LinkedIn feed here. Chris McGee, he's a lawyer that I've been talking to a lot about toxic workplace and other things. He says, I cannot wait to listen to this episode. June, who was tuning in for the show, she said, thank you, Ms. Stiles and Teresa, for a fantastic show. Keep the faith. She also said earlier that medical is extremely prejudiced about any neurological and mental challenges. And I would agree. We really do see physical as so much differently, and we need to stop that. Kirk Davis said, go through community care and the chief of mental health, to get this instituted at the VA. It sounds like you're trying to just do just that. And I will say, I will use whatever resources are available to me as a military podcaster to be your advocate, as I always do with the causes that I bring to this show. So, Leah, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to add that I didn't ask you about?
That's it. Just leaders, educate yourself and be open-minded, and people that are struggling, just don't struggle alone. That's it. I don't have all the answers. Just don't do it alone.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for an amazing episode. I really appreciate your time. I will meet you backstage. I'm going to go full screen just for a moment and give a quick closeout, but thank you all for watching this week. Really enjoyed this conversation immensely. It educated me, hopefully, as much as it did you. Next week, I have a leadership consultant expert. He's actually from the UK. I'm really excited to have him on. I have pretty much back-to-back shows all month, next month, and then booked out almost to November. So I'll be back, and I hope you guys will join us, and take care and enjoy the rest of your night. Bye-bye now.